Public discussions about autonomous weapons often focus on science fiction imagery. In practice, how are AI and autonomous technologies already reshaping military decision making and warfare today?
Yeah, AI is already sort of being integrated into military logistics, intelligence analysis, surveillance, target recognition, battlefield coordination, and in command and control systems as well. So the real transformation, I think, that we're seeing in real time is how these tools and technologies are shaping our understanding of threats, our perceptions about sort of what is an imminent challenge. They're prioritizing targets, and they're sort of these tools are being used to help soldiers, I guess, make decisions under time compression. However, I think what we've seen, especially in the recent attacks on Iran, is like the change of tempo of warfare, right? So, militaries, for them, speed is sort of everything, right? It's an incredible advantage. But I think what we're seeing, while these technologies promise a lot of faster, whether it's like data processing or whether it's, operational responses, it's created the sense that war is an engineering problem and that you can sort of engineer your way out of it. And I think that what we're seeing in real time happen, though, is sort of with the example of Iran, is really what the widespread impacts are of this perception, and particularly on the populations in these places, in these regions, but also more broadly on global security, like what it is doing to international security, but also the global economy. Like everything is being impacted by this sense that we could have these speedy and remote, right, wars, that you can do these wars at a distance, which has been this long held belief. And I think what is particularly really concerning is the way in which these tools are sort of restructuring decision making, and impacting sort of the level, or the quality of human judgment and control that's being exercised over some of that decision making.
So, supporters of military AI often argue that these systems could improve precision and reduce certain forms of harm and conflict. What are the limits of these claims, and what risks emerge when AI is integrated into targeting and command and control systems?
Yeah, sure. So I think there is some truth to the fact that these tools can improve military operations. So whether it's, better sensor fusion or image analysis, in some contexts that can be sort of helpful, right? But I think there's this assumption that technical precision then translates into ethical or lawful outcomes, right? Um, but war zones aren't neatly organized, right? They're not labs, where some of these maybe technologies have been tested under certain conditions, right? So I think what becomes really clear is you have to really understand the impacts of particular targeting and sort of the quality of the data that you're working with in the first place. You really need that sense of like the context, and you need that human judgment to make, I think, calls that are, profound, really, because they impact human lives and global security. So, a targeting decision that is not just about like identifying this object, right, correctly. It is also about understanding international humanitarian law requirements and norms, right? Proportionality assessments. If you're sort of observing a real-time context, whether there's civilian who become present in this scenario that maybe they weren't there a time before. So there are all of these, I think, moving parts that are, in my view, deeply contextual and require an understanding of, humans who are responsible and ultimately accountable for that decision making.
So what concerns you most about the rapid integration of AI and emerging technologies into military and security institutions, not only in terms of weapons themselves, but in how they may transform the speed, the scale, and the character of conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there is a danger that AI systems can create an illusion of certainty, right? And so there can be sort of recommendations that appear, really accurate, and then we overly trust these systems. And I think that sort of becomes the challenge, is that we have, I think, tools that can have sort of speedy results, but we're not necessarily pausing to think about sort of the quality of those results and what the intent is, or even the strategic goals, right? Like what's actually being achieved. So I think that sort of transformation um, of human decision making regarding the use of force is incredible. And I think that is the question we need to ask, really, who sort of is ultimately making these decisions? Are these governance institutions, are these laws that we have sort of set, have put in place, are they responding, right, to the sort of the evolving challenges in these new battle spaces? And that's where I think we have to, like that's where the concern is. I think we are in some ways seeing what happens when these systems that are at times interconnected can operate at incredible speeds and scales that we simply are not prepared for on the governance side, and sort of in the response side as well, in the humanitarian, the humanitarian sort of side.
Much of the current debate focuses on autonomous weapons and lately on AI decision support systems, but AI is increasingly embedded across supply chains, surveillance systems, software platforms, dual use technologies, et cetera. What do policymakers and the public still misunderstand about how AI is reshaping the global defense ecosystem and arms trade?
Absolutely. I do think it is a shift or a change in terms of how the defense sector and ecosystem works, in terms of, you noted dual use, the implications of these technologies, and how certain sort of infrastructure, which might be predominantly civilian, given its military use, can now become sort of, target, recognized military target, right? So I think what we're actually seeing really is this blurring of the lines between this sort of defense sector and civilian technology ecosystems, and that breakdown of those distinctions has implications. So I think many of the technologies that are in fact shaping AI today, everyone will recognize this, right, originates in the commercial sector, in the commercial space. So this is like, if you think from cloud computing, computer vision, semiconductors, right? So these are fundamentally dual use technologies. That means that we sort of can't think about, traditional arms exports in the same way, because what we're seeing is these are weapons that don't look like weapons, or they're part of a weapon, they're parts and components of weapon systems that are, commercial, that are dual use. And we might not be sort of thinking of them in that same way, but they're absolutely critical to the functioning of some of these systems. So I think what becomes much more challenging then to do is to trace that accountability, right, across the sort of supply chain. You might have a company that sees itself that primarily building a product for civilian use, but then that sort of same capability can be really important in some military application. So I think what's really clear is that we need more answers from the governance perspectives, and clear sort of lines about where are some of these technologies being applied, how they're being applied, some clarity from governments as well, in terms of how these technologies are transforming, the arms trade sector in general. That doesn't mean that, your conventional weapons are going away or have gone away. Like, quite to the contrary, right? We're seeing this sort of conventional arms trade still very much, of course, matters and impacts warfare. But we're also seeing this transformation, and what can be, this term that's not very easy, but this sort of sense of intelligentization of warfare that's contributing then to also having existing platforms that become much more intelligent. So I think in the first question, you're saying, like, well, how sort of, what are we imagining as an autonomous weapon system, right? And I think it's really important not to think of some futuristic system, but rather to think about existing weapons platforms, whether they're drones or loitering munitions, and think of them just with having greater autonomy, right? And that's where I think is this transformation of conventional arms trade that is happening as well, is that these sort of whether it's software components or other parts and components are coming in, and these weapons, then sort of this conventional weapon does become sort of course, a part of this new defense ecosystem. So we're dealing with, I think, a really great transformation of commercial innovation. There's a great push from a lot of countries, including a lot of middle powers, right? Sort of this idea of benefiting on both sides by investing in defense, and you will have dual use technologies, which can be then beneficial to your sort of economic bottom line as a country, but can also be useful to your military, right? It's very appealing as an argument, but I do think there is a challenge there in understanding what happens when you have this sort of intertwining of these different sectors. And what are the implications? Some of the commercial actors just are not used to seeing their infrastructure or their technologies, right, being targeted. And we saw this with data centers, right, in the Gulf. This is probably the first instance we've seen some of these data centers being targeted. And I think that's sort of the new reality, right? This sort of, yeah, this enmeshing of these different sectors. Arguably for a long time, there hasn't been this easy and nice distinction between what's commercial and, civilian technology and what's defense technology. But what I think is really different is that this technology actually originates in the commercial space, but then it's being applied in the battlefields. And it's not, it's not the militaries or the traditional defense contractors that have the know-how and the expertise. It's really these, major tech companies or, smaller tech companies that actually have that expertise.
International discussions on autonomous weapons and responsible military AI are entering an important phase. What key diplomatic processes and debates should people be paying attention to this year? And what kinds of governance measures or international commitments do you believe are most urgently needed?
Absolutely. So I think we are in a really important year for military AI governance. It's a pivotal year in some ways for the conventions or conventional weapons. And this year, countries will have to decide what to do with the mandate of that discussion. Will they just continue the dialogue? Maybe will they sort of, say that there will be some sort of negotiating mandate? I think that's the hope of a lot of people who'd like to see sort of clear regulation. Or maybe this will all sort of just go elsewhere outside of the CCW. I think what's most likely is this continuation of the dialogue. A lot of states do want to keep that sort of discussion within the CCW. But in some ways, I think what we have to really recognize is the extent to which that forum has sort of done its job, right? It has allowed a lot of smaller and medium states to get to know this issue a lot better. And it is a very technical and complex issue. It has provided an opportunity for information sharing and knowledge building, but clearly, its consensus sort of based way of working isn't really sort of allowing for anything concrete to come out of that. I think it's been really great to see the Netherlands, chairing this discussion now at CCW and really trying to pull different perspectives together. So I think it remains to be seen. In the fall, we'll have a better sense of where the CCW is going. At the same time, the responsible military AI, discussions, the REAIM summit, there was an earlier one that happened in Spain in early February. And there will be a meeting in a few weeks in June in Geneva on sort of trying to expand that discussion beyond autonomous weapons, but also being sort of aware where does the discussion need to go as well. So there is a bit of an existential question for the REAIM initiative. Does it continue being sort of, something that happens outside of that sort of multilateral system, this multi-stakeholder dialogue? or does it, try to become something that is under the UN umbrella? So I think that will be interesting to watch. So we have a lot of questions and we have very few answers in terms of like, what does the governance framework look like? The US-led political declaration on responsible AI and autonomy, for example, has for the most part seems to have fallen by the wayside. There isn't a great deal of attention to it, but it did have, a lot of US allies who had supported it, endorsed it. So I think it'll be interesting to see where that goes or what happens with that. And so we are just in this space where I think where countries are aware that something needs to be done, that there do need to be guidelines. I think it was perhaps a little small ray of light. Recently, the United States and China acknowledged that, AI could lead to escalation of conflict, and there does need to be greater dialogue. So I think in the medium term, or sorry, in the short term, what we need to do is continue these dialogues and ensure that countries are ready to sort of move towards discussions that could lead to clearer regulation. Because what we saw recently with Anthropic and the Pentagon is that this professor from George Washington University said, it's this regulation by contract does not work well for anyone. We need clarity. So there should not be sort of a contract that determines, the sort of ad hoc nature of this sort of approach is not sufficient. So we really do need that clarity at the international level. So all to say that there is a great deal of uncertainty about the governance right now. I think there's a great deal of acknowledgement that governance has not kept up with real-time developments in the battlefield in Ukraine and Gaza, Iran, other places. We see this technology being applied, and the governance discussion really is sort of, I think, being challenged in terms of being able to come up with a response that is going to have a meaningful impact on what is actually happening in practice as well. So this is not just a technological debate. This isn't just about sort of figuring out sort of the best technological response or formula. It really is, I think, an enormous governance challenge for countries. And we need so many more constraints, safeguards, rules of the road for some of the use of this technology, and then just clarity on some real red lines that I think that will contribute a great deal to sort of global stability as we see these technologies being used and deployed at greater scale.